Hi. A lot of people talk about white bass as a spring fish or a summer fish because they make absolutely great runs up the tributaries of rivers and out of lakes into the feeder arms. The fishing can be incredible, but what a lot of people don't know is that white bass fishing can also be really strong in the fall too. And one of the things I like even more about fall white fishing is that those fish have spent all summer feeding up. They're fatter, they're healthier, they're not worn out from the spawn like they are a lot of times when you fish them in the spring. So they're a lot feistier and just inch for inch a lot more pull and a lot more fun. And they're feeding really, really aggressively because they're trying to get fed up for the winter, so getting as much food in their bellies as they can. And so they're hitting harder, they're taking a lot bigger variety of flies, and their mood is just a little more on feeding and feeding as much as they can. And so when you get into them, you can usually get into them pretty well. So with that in mind, I thought I'd spend a little time this morning talking to you about the gear and the things that you need to know to hunt white bass in the fall. So I figure we'll start out with rods. And what I like in a rod is I will typically use a 9-foot rod in either a 6-weight or an 8-weight for white bass. You could probably handle the fish on a little lighter rod, but I find that casting into the wind, casting a little bigger flies, a little heavier rod is the way to go. And these fish are definitely going to put a nice strong bend even on a little heavier rod, so it's still going to be a lot of fun to catch them. Lines, I'm typically going with a floating line, although occasionally I will, if it gets real windy and I need something to get down below the wave action, or if the fish are just down deeper and I just need to get to them and can't get there with just a weighted fly, I will add a sink tip. A person could carry a spare reel with a sink tip line, but I usually carry just a selection of sink tips and different sink rates that I can attach to the end of my floating line. And I'll get those out here in just a second and show you what those look like. So the sinking leader tips that I was talking about are just simply a small section of sinking line. Usually come in different lengths. You can get them in 8-foot lengths, 12-foot lengths. Sometimes I've seen them all the way up to 20, but at that point you might as well just put on a full sinking line and be done with it. So I usually tend to fish an 8-foot length just because it seems to get me where I need to go. The casting is still fairly easy. These are real simple to use. You just uncoil them, and you see the loop at the end here is just going to loop onto the loop on your fly line if you have one. If not, they're fairly easy to install. And then that's just going to convert your floating line to an easy sink tip and allow you to get out there and get under that wave activity, or allows you to push into the wind just a little bit easier. Leader selection is pretty simple. White bass aren't particularly leader shy, so we can go with something that's going to be heavy enough to turn over a larger fly, a weighted fly, fairly easily. I kind of like the bass tapered leaders just because they do have a heavier butt section and a little shorter taper, so they're going to roll over those flies easier. But if a person wanted to run with just a standard 1X or 2X leader, that's also going to work just fine. I like the 9-foot. I like the longer length because it helps let the fly get down a little further if I'm not going to a sink tip line. However, if it gets windy, there's no reason why a person couldn't go to a 7.5-foot leader to get a little better turnover. Again, with the fish not being too terribly leader shy, length isn't going to be a critical issue as far as whether or not they hit. So whatever length is the most comfortable for you casting. Like I said, I like to go a little heavier, a little stiffer for bigger flies and or heavier flies, especially in windy situations. And 1X or 2X, or in this case I'm fishing bass leaders in a 12-pound test tippet. Those are going to work fine. When I go to the sinking line or the sink tip, I'll generally just tie on about 3 or 4 feet of 1X or 2X tippet, and that gets the job done just fine. Flies for white bass is going to be also a fairly simple thing. For the most part, they're going to be foraging on minnows, bait fish, shad, occasionally crawdads, especially up on the shallower rocky flats. But having a fairly simple assortment of flies that are going to cover those eventualities. Anything from baby bluegill to more lifelike shad patterns, a little bit of a crayfish imitation there, several different minnow and bait fish type themes. I do like to keep a couple of surface poppers along just in case they are busting shad on the surface. That can be a good bite. And then I'll also keep a few more brightly colored flies that aren't really particularly imitative of anything color-wise. But if I get a little murkier water, if the wind's blowing and I've got a mud line, these flies are going to be a little more visible to the fish, and they're going to see them a little better. Hopefully going to eat them a little easier. But again, like I said, a few clousers weighted with either lead dumbbells or nickel dumbbells to get them down at various sink rates. The nickel's not going to sink as fast as the lead. I'll also keep quite a few unweighted flies in the box for either when I'm fishing very shallow situations or if the fish aren't demanding that I get down that deep to get to them. Crawfish patterns, of course, are always going to be fished fairly close to the bottom usually, so they're always going to be weighted either with the nickel or the lead eyes. But again, just a handful of just real easy patterns there that will get the job done in almost every situation. So obviously the best day to go fishing is, when you can, but there are some conditions that are going to make things better for fall white bass fishing, and today is not a lot of them. We've had a pretty full moon the last couple of nights, and when the moon's full, the shad and the bait fish are usually more active at night, and the fish are feeding more at night. So, moon phase can have something to do with it. Cloudy days are good for the same reason. Lower light conditions, bait fish are going to stay in shallow a little longer. The bigger fish are going to feel more confident in coming and hunting them up. If you do have a nice sunny day like you have today, a good wind is a good idea. If you can get that 5 to 10 mile an hour wind blowing, enough wind that you get a good chop on the water to break up the light penetration, but not so much wind that you can't cast into it. That's going to help as well. A lot of times those fish are that wind is going to push fish in a little closer to ambush points, main lake points and rocky flats, chunk rock areas, things like we've got here. You can see these piles of rocks that we have. Normally when the lake level's at its normal level, these would be just under the surface of the water, but it's been a little dry this fall, and so things are out of the water. Good time to scout around because you can kind of see these things, so you can come back when the lake levels are up to where they're supposed to be, and you'll know exactly where to go to find where those ambush points are, and those fish are going to be. All right, just wanted to say a few things about retrieving for white bass. One of the things that's very important to remember is that white bass are motion triggered, so we're not going to want to let that fly stay still for very long. So you're probably not going to be doing a lot of long pauses on your retrieves. A lot of short pauses, of course, maybe to give that fly a little bit of a more erratic motion like an actual bait fish. It can be short retrieves, short quick retrieves like this, or you can stretch those out to longer retrieves. It doesn't really matter. At first, you just want to try something, and if that doesn't work, keep trying something else. You can alternate that up, a couple short ones, longer one, couple short ones again. Just kind of keep testing things until you figure out what the fish on that particular day are looking for. The other thing is going to be the water column, making sure that you fish the entire water column from top to bottom. I usually like to do that from top to bottom in that direction. I'll start out by laying out a cast and immediately starting my retrieve on that cast. And that way I'm just fishing up in the first few inches of the water column, and I'll know if there's any fish feeding near the surface. I'll know pretty quickly if that's where I need to be. A couple of casts is usually enough to tell. If you can see shad or other bait fish working on the top of the water, that's definitely going to tell, and you may want to give it a few more tries. But if nothing's happened in those first couple casts, let it settle for a little while. Let it settle for the count of 2 or the count of 3 to get a little deeper in the water column, and then start your retrieve. Vary up those strips. Once you get fishing deeper in the water column, if you're fishing on a floating line, the strips are going to tend to pull that fly up through the water column a little bit. So there, pausing every once in a while to let that fly settle back down to where you need it to be isn't going to be a bad idea. And you will occasionally get a fish hit that fly on the drop. Throw it out again if nothing happened. Count down a little further, maybe about 4 seconds, 5 seconds, and then start that retrieve again. Still changing it up, still some long strips, some short strips, but keeping that fly moving. Very short pauses, if any pauses at all, until you find out where they're at. And you keep doing that until you've either hit the fish or found the bottom. With fishing crawfish patterns, it's going to be different. You're going to start out fishing down on the bottom. And you're going to want to make a few more pauses because the crayfish move that way. It's more of a start, stop type motion. So it's going to be pop him a couple of times, give it a little bit of a pause. Pop him a couple of times, give it a little bit of a pause. But you still don't want those pauses to be too long. You don't want those pauses to be long enough that the fish has a chance to lose interest in that fly. And they will. If you pause that fly too long, food means moving to a white bass. So if you pause that fly too long and it stops moving, he's going to ignore it and go away and look for something else that's acting more lifelike. So there you go. Keys to the kingdom on the retrieve. Keep the fly moving, fish all the way through the water column, and vary your strips and your retrieves, and you should be pretty successful at finding fish if there's any there to be found. Well, and there you go. That's pretty much what you need to know for fall white bass fishing. Hey, hopefully you'll be able to take what you learned and turn it into some of these guys. So we'll get him back in the water and catch some more of them, and we'll see you guys in the next one. If you're fishing with a crayfish pattern, it's going to be a little bit different. You're going to want to start that fly. Whoops. You're going to want to start not snagging up on the rocks on the side of the lake. And you're going to want to not be wrapped around the tip of the rod either. And there's going to be about 2 minutes of this video that's going to go straight to the blooper reel while we straighten things out.